everybody. Really nice to have everyone here today. Today is the 20th of February, which is the World Day of Social Justice. My name is Lauren Jonathan, and I'm the founder and director of Hear My Voice Women's Network. And I also have with me Evelyn. Evelyn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. So nice to see you today. I'm Evelyn. I am the Program and Research Coordinator for Hear My Voice Women's Network. And I am excited to be part of our celebration for the World Day of Social Justice today.
Thanks, Evelyn. And we're really excited. We have 4 wonderful speakers with us today who will each be talking about the different pillars of social justice. The reason that we really wanted to host this event and talk about social justice today is, we hear about social justice, it's mentioned in the news, on social media, but feel that often it's a buzzword and people aren't really clear on what it means and really understanding the different elements and aspects of social justice. There are multiple definitions of social justice, which makes it even harder for people to understand and define. There are multiple different approaches to social justice. And so we are here today with one specific approach. As I said, there's many approaches, but we're going to just talk about one today to try to clarify and deepen your understanding of social justice overall. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Evelyn, who will introduce our first speaker for the day.
To begin today, we will have Kesang, who is a lecturer at law with a focus on administration law based in Bhutan, talking about the pillar of access. So I will now pass the floor over to Kesang. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. So access from a social justice perspective means having fair access to services and resources that the state is providing. It is based on the belief that all human beings are equal before the law, and the notion of fairness in terms of fair access is often linked with the notion of equality. But I believe that access is much more nuanced and complex compared to equality. Equality implies that all people, regardless of their gender, race, age, class, language, religion, and even physical ability, are entitled to benefit from public services and resources equally. Now, that can be viewed as having access to livelihood, capacities, education, health, decision-making, and so on. But the concept of access has much more layers and dimensions to it. For one, it addresses the disparities of not being able to access the goods and services by a marginalized section in a society. Let's say, for example, access to employment opportunities. Now, if a country does not have policies that require buildings to be disability friendly, then a person with disability will not have the same or equal access to available job opportunities in the market. Another example, individuals from wealthy households or from households from upper or upper middle classes, they're often better able to afford to attend good schools and access post-secondary education, which leads to a greater chance of obtaining jobs with higher income in the future, while those from lower socioeconomic classes face fewer opportunities. It in turn sort of limits access to education for future generations as well, and also continues the cycle of facing disadvantages. So you kind of sort of see the disparity and the gap here, and what that calls for is policy intervention. And there isn't sort of one clear framework or intervention for what a successful access looks like in practice. And it really has to be contextualized according to the needs of various marginalized groups in the community. So yeah, as long as we are committed to the cause of social justice, progress is possible. Focus should be on providing a much more equal playing field for everyone, and hence sort of increasing and restoring access and giving everyone equal opportunity for a good life. Thanks.
Next, we will have Amelie. Amelie is a human rights advocate and law student based in South Africa. Today, she is going to be talking about the pillar of human rights. So Amelie, I will pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. There is no absolute social justice without the protection and advocacy of human rights. Firstly, I'd like to define what social justice is. Social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. What is human rights, you ask? Human rights are the standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. They govern how we operate basically as a society. So you ask yourself, where do human rights fit in the achievement of social justice? In order to ensure the above meanings that I just mentioned, we need to ensure that human rights exist in order to uphold the social justice that we are here to celebrate today. And you ask yourself, why should I care about human rights when we're discussing social justice? Currently, there are 130 countries, as reported by the Human Rights Watch, where women cannot even start or even finish school. You ask yourself, why does this happen? Because there's a poor regard to the right of basic education when it comes to women. Women don't have accessibility to this human right in comparison to their male counterparts. Secondly, there are 71 countries where homosexuality is illegal. Many women end up being raped, correctively raped for their sexuality, which leads to killings. There's a rising number of femicide. There's a rising number of gender-based violence. All of these which hinder society from achieving social justice. And the root of this is because of the lack of respecting human rights of women, children, and queers globally, which a lot of the time, these are intersectionality based, and these need attention to society. So you ask yourself, why are we here today, and how would we solve this using human rights? There are two things that require us to come to attention in order for us to have human rights advocacy. On a societal level, there needs to be horizontal accountability of rights. We need to ensure that we hold each other accountable for the various rights. There needs to be a decrease of femicide. Men need to respect the bodies of women. Men need to respect the bodies of children. Men need to respect the bodies of queers. On a societal level, there should be killing and stopping of killing and shaming of people. There needs to be a point where we respect each other's rights and where we stand. Citizens need to come together, NGOs and organizations on an international level, to respect the rights of people and to maintain the dignity of people, because we cannot achieve social justice without the advocacy and protection of human rights. Secondly, on a vertical level, on a governmental level, we require the vetting of rights and people to make sure that government stops infringing on the rights of people. On an institutional level, there needs to be a lot of work done. We need a reform. We need a reform from government. Government needs to be lobbied in order to change their policy, their constitutions, their foreign policy with other states, to ensure that the rights of women, children, and queers are upheld on a global scale. There needs to be a lot of work done where we re-socialize the environment that we live within to make sure that everyone has the equal access that I have stated in the political, economic, and social rights. All of these are rights that need to be put together in deterring poverty, exclusions, and discrimination on an institutional level. Evidently, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to reform rights and implement human rights globally. There's a call to the government. There's a call to the citizens. There's a call to you and I, because remember, there's no social justice without the advocacy and protection of human rights on a global scale. Thank you.
Helen will be talking about the third pillar of social justice. Helen is a law teacher and university lecturer with a particular focus on clinical legal education programs based in Australia. Helen will be talking about the pillar of participation. So now I will hand the floor over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Participation, what is it? So being able to actively participate in society is a fundamental pillar of social justice. It's not just being present, although present is important, it's actively being involved in the decision-making, from the rules that govern a community and a broader society, to the foodstuffs available at the market, to the style of education that's available to all. A common saying I hear very, very often today is, you cannot be what you cannot see. How many women, particularly young women, participate in decision-making at the governmental level? How many participate at the community level? The answers are quite different in many different communities. If young women can only see the limited ways in which they can participate in society, they are less likely to give it a go. Many of us come from patriarchal societies where the bulk of the decisions affecting a person's life are made by middle-class to affluent men. Those in power get to participate, and more often than not, those not in power do not. We celebrate the 1 or 2 women that reach those levels, but we can't really celebrate until at least half of those positions are filled with women from all age groups and backgrounds. We want and we need to hear women's voices, and they need to be listened to. We're in a time when young women are coming forward and voicing their concerns, their need for change, and their right to participate in all aspects of society. This will be the only way that power imbalances can be shifted. Only then can those who have traditionally been excluded start participating and changing the dynamic. What we can celebrate, though, is the role that women play in their communities, keeping their communities safe. This has just been so evidenced in the many times during the pandemic where it's been women who have been able to raise the issues for their communities and keep them safe. At the same time, they're raising and educating the young, and they're nurturing the young to participate and to step into decision-making roles within their communities. I long to see my profession, the law, representative of all cultural groups and ages, and the same for all levels of government. The numbers of male and female students in law schools is roughly equal in Australia, but the number of women and people from different cultural groups who make up the judiciary is minimal. We have a long way still to go for equal participation in senior roles within the legal profession, and that's only one area. Often Indigenous peoples can show the broader community how participation is done. They are experts at listening, at problem solving and finding solutions. We have much to learn from our Indigenous peoples about participation. Thank you.
We will now hear about the final pillar of social justice from Liliane. Liliane is a senior political science student based in Lebanon. Today, she is talking about the pillar of equity. I will now pass the floor to Liliane. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. So yes, I will be speaking of equity, its importance to equality, and its contribution to social justice. So when we hear the term equity, it is usually misunderstood or confused with the term equality. So when equality has to do with distributing resources and opportunities to everyone the same way and treating everyone exactly the same, equity is different. Equity distributes these resources based on our differences and based on every individual's specific needs and specific capabilities. So when we want to achieve equality in a society, we would be treating everyone the same, and we would be giving every opportunity or every valued good to everyone exactly the same way. But when we want to achieve equity, we would be taking into consideration the differences of each community, of each group, or of each person. And we would be looking at which community or which person is in need of this specific resource more than the other. And this way, we would be ensuring that everyone is getting what they deserve, and we wouldn't be wasting certain resources when they aren't really needed. So in this sense, how does equity lead to equality? In certain issue areas, such as public health or gender or racial justice, I think it is important to highlight our differences instead of ignoring them. Because when we do so, it would be, we would make it easier for resources or goods to be allocated based on our differences. So for instance, if I'm a teacher and I am explaining a lesson to a class full of students, when I know that there is a certain student with special needs, I can either explain the lesson exactly the same way to every student without taking into consideration that some students might need a little bit more help, or they need to understand the lesson a little bit differently. Or I can take into consideration that each student has his own capabilities and his own abilities, and I would take maybe a few more minutes to explain the lesson to the specific students with special needs. So this is why, in order to create true equality, equity is needed to ensure that everyone is getting the same chance to get there. So as we can see, equity does play an important role in achieving social justice. Because if we want to achieve a just or a fair society, then equality wouldn't be the way to do that. Equity looks at our differences. It understands that every person has his own abilities and every person isn't the same as everyone. And I don't think it's wrong to look at our differences, and it's not wrong to highlight them, because when we do so, then we would be treating everyone the same way. Thank you.
So wonderful. Thank you all to our amazing speakers for sharing about the 4 pillars of social justice. It really helps us to get a better understanding of what social justice means, why it's important, and also actions that we can take to achieving social justice. So now we'd just like to have a bit more of an open discussion with all of you, pick your brains a little bit more. And so as we are here and we're talking specifically about social justice and gender, we just wanted to ask all of you to share with us your ideas around why you think it's important to view social justice with a gendered lens, and maybe some of the negative impacts that might happen if we don't use that gendered lens as we approach social justice. So anyone have any thoughts on this question?
I'm happy to look at it from the idea of participation, or I can look at it more broadly, whichever you like. I think because, as I said, in the pillar of participation, because many of us come from patriarchal societies where all the decisions are made by largely men and largely affluent men, many people, and particularly women, being generally half of the society, do not get the opportunity to participate in that decision making. So if we look at the decisions that governments make, for instance, about healthcare, for instance, and if we don't look at the needs of women in particular, those decisions are not going to be fair and equitable to at least half of the society. And yes, men can be highly educated, but they have not necessarily experienced many of the health needs that women experience. So there need to be women at those decision-making tables in order for women's needs to be heard and addressed. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. Would anyone else like to jump in? I don't want to speak too much, but I'll let you guys all have a chance.
If I may sort of add onto what Helen said. So Bhutan was historically a much more matriarchal society. So women were usually the head of the family. But as sort of, Bhutan sort of became modernized, the men were sent to school because, women were more important in the family. But then over the years, men sort of started to go to offices and women were like taking up the role of becoming housewives. Then that narrative again changed to becoming a dual sort of breadwinner model. But it seemed like when it comes to household chores, it was still the women that had to do everything. So there was a lot of sort of extra responsibility and extra burden that women are taking still sort of prevalent right now. And that is something so nuanced. And because when people talk about gender disparity, they think, oh, it has to be something so sort of, upfront and quite sort of, visibly sort of there. But and these kind of sort of nuanced narratives are often sort of overlooked. So I think sort of there has to be sort of a reflection on sort of these kind of narratives that are happening in all types of societies.
Great, Kesang. Yeah, so talking about how, I guess, the injustices can start from home and they can be very, I guess, seen as, small or insignificant, and maybe just talking about, the role of even a girl child or a boy child in the home, whether or not they have chores to do, whether or not they get opportunities to school. And then Helen's talking, it was really interesting, Helen, talking more on a policy level, thinking about, yeah, thinking about healthcare, it's such a topical issue right now. And I guess having all these rules and regulations over a woman's body, over, whether or not she has access to sexual and reproductive healthcare, what kind of access she has, who determines that access. But we see that this kind of restrictions on males' healthcare does not exist. And so that this is obviously a very big debate in many countries right now, about who decides over women's bodies and why can't they make decisions themselves. And so thank you so much, Helen, for raising that specific issue. Emily or Liliane, I invite you. Do you have anything to add into this discussion?
I think most of that I wanted to say has been covered, that there's basically a need for women in these spaces because of the majority of women being part of the population, majority of the population being women, and because women also tend to be victims of violations such as social justice, that's why they need to occupy these spaces, as Helen had mentioned. So I believe I've been covered.
Great, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
I'd like to add something also. If you want to look at it through the pillar that I talked about, which is equity. It's usually when we say that women and men should be equal. Unfortunately, it's understood in a way that then I can hit a woman if they're equal. Then a woman can do something exactly the same way as men. Then a woman can hold this very heavy thing exactly the same way as men. But this isn't really the way that it should be understood. I think when we say that they're equal, maybe we should mean that they're equal of gaining or of getting the same chances. Then why should a woman not get the same opportunities or chances as a man? Like, the gender of a person shouldn't be the only determinant of their success or the only determinant of how they are as a person. It should be their abilities. It should be how they treat people. So yeah.
Great, Liliane. And it's really interesting because as I'm listening, I see how there's so much overlap in these pillars. And, what Helen was talking about earlier about participation, it's not just about being present. And so I think we see in some countries, they're like, well, we have women and men in leadership. We have 50-50%, but what is their actual ability maybe to participate and actually share their voices about the things that they really want to talk about? Because if they're still in the patriarchal system, it might not be okay for them to talk about, having free access to, again, we can go back to healthcare and other stuff. So it's not just about numbers, as having, we have X amount of women in leadership, but it's about ensuring that we have women that are able to actively participate, and it's not tokenism. Numbers, just saying, well, there's a woman there, so we've done our job, we filled the quota, but making sure that those women in those positions actually can participate actively.
On what you're saying, Lauren, I think because we've been in an era where we're just trying to get a lot of representation, the numbers in representation are rising, right? But there's the numbers in terms of there'll be 50% of a parliament that has 50% women, right? But then 100% patriarchy. So then there's a lot that needs to happen, not only on an institutional level. I did speak of this in my ideal, but on a societal level, that we need to unsocialize ourselves, just re-socialize. So it's basically an unlearning and learning mechanism. There's a lot of women who are part of what in feminist language we call it the cult of femininity. So a lot of women who are still part of these patriarchal systems because they grew up in them. So there needs to be a lot of work done on a societal level to relearn things and unlearn things such as this for men. This is a male career. When someone wants to go into mining engineering, you're like, oh, you want to go to a male-dominated industry. So then there's a lot of tokenism that's happening because people haven't unlearned and relearned certain things that they need to in order to let go of this patriarchal system.
Great, Emily, and that's such a great point. And I think, yeah, it's really about re-educating people about these gender roles or gender stereotypes, and kind of raising awareness around what, I think a lot of people are unaware, like you said, Emily. They, all they've ever known is the system. And so they can't maybe even identify where there's injustices, because they think, well, this is just how it is. This is just the normal way of things. And so I think, as Helen had said, that, a lot of women are becoming, especially young women, becoming more aware, speaking out. But there's still a lot of change that needs to happen across all generations, right? Because it's great that young women or young people are becoming more aware, but there's still other generations that also need to be aware so that actual change can take place in society. So thank you for sharing that.
Just to add on to Emily, I was recently reading an article about a female actor who was criticized for looking her age. So basically, she had aged. So people were criticizing that she looked her age. She looked old, and how sort of. So I agree with Emily saying that the sort of the perspective has to be first changed on a societal level. So there has to be a lot of dialogue, awareness, because I think before we sort of talk about policies and interventions, I think the whole attitude and perspective towards gender really has to sort of change.
Thank you, Kesang. Anyone else like to add anything? Evelyn, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, it's just as I was listening to everyone share and share about the pillars earlier as well, and just having this discussion more about the gender lens to be applied, I think that it's really interesting to look at social justice in this way. Lauren, you already mentioned that there's some overlap here, quite a bit of when we're talking about the gender lens and why it's important. I think when we're looking at social justice in this way that breaks it down by these fundamental pillars, can be a really unique exercise to listen to. And just when I'm thinking about maybe the action that can come out of this, when we're talking about pursuing social justice in our communities and raising this awareness, and what does that mean? And to think about it in this way of working towards equity, access, participation, and human rights, it's interesting to look at it for a gender lens for each of those pillars in a way that works towards the goal of achieving social justice. Kesang mentioned making sure that we look at the nuances of the experience. And I think that that's really important too, when we're looking at each of these pillars, and what does that mean when we're taking action that actually works for people in our community or individuals that we come face to face with every day. And I really just appreciate everyone's reflections on this. And Amelie, you mentioned about that intersectional approach when we're taking action, we're looking at the human rights scope throughout all of this. And I think my reflection and takeaway from our discussion today about how interconnected each of these pillars are, and when we're looking at perhaps raising awareness as a type of action to increase social justice, how important it is to have that gender lens throughout that, and making sure that it is responsive to those nuances that we've talked about here. So yeah, just thank you everyone. And it's just been a really great discussion to listen in on.
Great, thank you so much, Evelyn. And yeah, maybe just to kind of close our space, it would be really nice. I know that all of you are very active and have done a lot in your own communities to promote social justice. So maybe for those listening, what is maybe some advice or tips that you could give to others when they're advocating to promote social justice in their communities?
I'm happy to go first.
Sure.
I think I think taking a bit about what Emily was saying is looking at re-examining the way we do pretty well everything that we do, the way we raise children, the way we honour or applaud certain activities in the communities over others, because there's very much sorry, it's late at night, an indication that some sports, some cultural activities are more important, and there might be the sport might attract more young boys or more men. So it's looking at all aspects of life and looking at whether there's an opportunity for all of those activities to be valued and perhaps turn that around a little bit, and not just go with the things that we've always gone with, which says that this sport or this activity or making this money and the way that money's made is so important for value in society. So and that requires not only those of us who want to reanalyze that, but those who are in those positions being prepared to really think through, in order to get to those positions, to have that level of kudos, of credibility in a community. What have they had to do to get that? And what do they have to continue to do to keep that level of power and credibility? And does that mean other people lose out? And I think if people honestly analyse that, they would find that the answer would always be yes. For me to have this, that there are people who are missing out. And unless we're going to get people to analyse those things for themselves, then we're not going to achieve social justice.
Thank you so much for that answer, Helen. Yeah, very well said. Anyone else like to share some reflections?
I believe the most important thing is to be relentless about what you want to do. So definitely in being an advocate of any sort, and then the most difficult thing, which is human rights, where someone will ask you, what do I profit from advocating for this? People will always question, what's the purpose of this? How will it help me? I believe it's just being relentless, and being relentless in educating others about it, and being relentless about promoting it. Promote what you believe in, promote the human right that you, if you're want to advocate for education for girls in your area, if you want to advocate for equal access, for better accessibility for disabled people, be relentless fighting about that. If it means relentless going to each until you find a company that's going to sponsor you, don't give up on it. It's a very difficult concept that, especially in a capitalistic world, it's very difficult to come around something that does not profit on a money level, but profits on people. So be relentless about it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Emily. And as you were speaking, I was also thinking about something that that I faced, right? That people always feel that because we're advocating for a certain right, for example, we're focusing specifically on women's rights and gender, that people are like, well, why don't you focus on disability rights? And this is it's not that I believe that any rights are more or less important than each other. They're all very equal, but that our expertise, my expertise, Evelyn's expertise is in women's rights and gender. So that's where we focus, and it doesn't somehow diminish other rights. We're not saying, oh, they're not important, but we are specifically focusing on this area. And I think that's a question that people ask all the time. And I feel like maybe it is this capitalist place where people feel there's a competition between rights, that there's somehow have to be a superiority or some kind of, which right is more important than the other. And I definitely don't think that. And I think also raising awareness around that there's not a hierarchy of rights. They're all equally important. But because of the skill sets and the different knowledge that we need when advocating for different types of rights, and also going back to the, we talked about empathy and experience, you know, I necessarily don't have personal experience with disability, so maybe I'm not the right person to then advocate for those rights. So yeah, I just think that's a really important point as well, to note that by advocating for one set of rights doesn't mean we're saying that others are not important.
Definitely. I believe there's capitalism has put us on oppression Olympics. Like we're trying to we're fighting to prove which right matters more. And I believe that we have chosen women's right because it is our lived experience. It does not mean that we do not care about the lived experiences of disabled people. And we realize that women's right, women's feminism and women's and being a womanist or whatever you identify as means intersectionality. When you identify women's rights, we identify the rights of disabled women, queer women, women in corporate. There are so many. We identify environmental rights because women need a place to stay in. Therefore, we also come into climate rights. So definitely it's having our wholesome lens, realizing that women's right feeds into other rights. That's why we prioritize it.
Great, excellent, Emily. Yeah, great point. Anyone else like to share any final thoughts?
Just as an advice, though everything has been sort of already shared, I think one shouldn't isolate themselves. They should sort of find people that, you know, sort of care about the social issue and sort of have the conversation going. Then you become like a much more sort of, you know, powerful sort of force rather than doing it alone. And also sort of, I think advocating sort of for your social issues in social media. Nowadays, social media has become such a powerful tool. Even the government is sort of, you know, listening to what's happening around social media. So I think using the platform would also sort of really enable you to sort of move forward with your social issue.
Great advice, Kesang. Thank you so much for sharing.
I think my advice would be, like, on top of everything that you've already said, is yes, to always advocate for what you believe in. If you believe that what you're doing will help people, then yes, do it, and raise the voices of those who are unable to speak. But while also not overlooking the differences, not overlooking the needs of each individual and each community that you're helping, because in order to ensure that everyone is treated equally, and in order to ensure that everyone has the chance to reach equality, you need to understand that everyone has different needs and everyone has different capabilities, so they can't really reach them without help. So you'd be this person who would take a certain community or a certain group of people to the next step of reaching equality.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, Liliane. Great. So it's just been so nice to have all of you here, sharing about the pillars and then talking about these different issues. And you know, as today is World Social Justice Day, it's really great to raise awareness about social justice and what it means, and helping to educate people. We feel that it's something that we talk about a lot, but we don't really understand it. So we hope that those of you watching this video today have a deeper understanding of social justice, also have some ideas about how to promote social justice in your own community. If you check out the information below the video, you'll find our details for Hear My Voice, and you'll also find the details of all of our speakers today. So if you do have any further questions or would like any further information, you can reach out to us. And thank you all for joining us on your different time zones. And it's been just such a pleasure to have everyone here.